Hi, everyone. Ed Bixby here from the Global Green Burial Alliance, and this is Spotlight Now. Today, I'm here with Lucie Salmon of Humo Sapiens. Lucie is a spokesperson for Humo Sapiens, a nonprofit working towards making regenerative funerary alternatives legal and accessible in France, where highly restrictive funerary laws allow for no form of natural burial. Humo Sapiens strives to bring about a change to death care that recognizes death's place in the cycle of life. To do so, Humo Sapiens has an interdisciplinary research committee, forensic entomology, environmental sciences, cemetery management, compost science, and advocacy committee working on creating awareness. So welcome, Lucie.
Hi, thank you for having us.
You're very welcome. Glad to have you. well, we're here today to have a really important discussion about, the ability to create some of these options in France for the European parts of our association. So why don't we learn a little bit more about the types of burial options that are currently permitted in France, and how does the termination process offer something completely different than those current options?
So in France, we have only two choices. One is burial in a cemetery, 1.50 m underground, so that's about 6 feet, and very often in a cement vault. So the funerary operators will suggest a cement vault. Some cemeteries require it, although legally that's questionable as to whether they're allowed to do that, or cremation, again in a coffin. The cemeteries are all municipal, so there are very few, aside from a couple of military cemeteries, there are very few cemeteries that are privately owned in France. So they all fall under the same law, and that's all we can do.
Okay, well, that certainly is a situation that we hope to rectify, or at least help with this conversation. So, with your research, how have the French citizens embraced eco-friendly funeral alternatives? I mean, would you believe that French funeral providers are open to accepting, these newer but very old options?
So conversations we've had with funerary providers tend to say, well, if it's legal, we'll provide it for the public. The reason that we're having difficulty pushing that forward is obviously there's a bit of a taboo around death. So it's not something people really think about much before they're faced with this legislation. And otherwise the public providers tend to want it to happen. Then in the public, we've done several surveys. So one survey there are several surveys, and we did one of the surveys with an insurance company to see how people would respond to changes in legislation, and there tends to be a very positive response to the idea of ecological alternatives. So I think around 70% of the respondents wanted their death to have a regenerative impact. Then terramation itself, depending on the survey, it was between 46 and 20% would want that for themselves to be composted.
Well, that's very encouraging. That's encouraging news, and I think will be very helpful for the conversations that you'll have in the future when it comes to speaking to the legislation. With that being said, has terramation been introduced to lawmakers? And if so, how does that conversation stand currently?
There was one proposition loi, I don't know how you'd say that in English, a law proposal, I don't know.
Yeah, that would be correct.
Yeah, a law proposal was submitted by the Modem, which is a sort of center party, which garnered some interest. So there was a governmental day where they had the different associations and researchers working on the question in the National Assembly to discuss the question, but it didn't go very far because of the fact that, well, there are lots of different reasons, but one of the reasons was that the proposal itself was asking for a specific process to be legalized, whereas our stance is more that we want to have the right to do more research in order to establish what would be the best ways to proceed in the specific French context.
Okay, well that makes sense, and I mean, you know, the bureaucracy involved certainly can be quite a bit to you know to surmount, but that's positive that at least the conversation is starting.
Mm-hmm.
With that being said, now we know that you know there are natural burial options in Europe itself. At you know in the United Kingdom, of course, there's quite a bit of it happening.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any external organizations that are offering termation in other legalized locations in Europe that might be exploring, let's say, expansion into France? Like, so are there any conversations of companies that offer this that would maybe assist or want to be part of that bureaucracy part, I should say?
So in Germany, there's a lander that's got a pilot project on at the moment. So the company is called Mein Erde, and they call their process Reerdigung, which I can't remember what the exact translation is, but I think it's re-earthing or something. So they're in a pilot process working with various different researchers to see, for example, when the DNA stops existing, and that'll kind of dictate whether they can be fully legalized or not in Germany. Any expansion into the French market would today be completely impossible because you can't not have a coffin. You legally have to be in a coffin. It's very specific. It has to be, I think 22 millimeters thick. If it's for burial, it has to be minimum. I think it's a little bit less for cremation, but it's so tightly sort of restricted that we couldn't do that really.
That's find that very interesting. It's hard to imagine that something that we've done since the dawn of time would, and that it's so simple, you know, would require, or that they would have had the forethought to create laws to possibly prevent that. I think the interesting part of your conversation, when you further it along, would be why did these laws become what they are today?
That's something I find really fascinating. Is we have funerary laws which dictate these conditions that date from mostly 1804. So it's an imperial decree. I don't know if you say decree in English.
Yes,
Um,
that's correct.
which which was established by Napoleon, and which is prior to any amount of research that, or even the birth of the field of, I don't know how you say pedology, soil sciences. So all of the soil sciences, all of the groundwater contamination, all of these sciences are after date from after our funerary legislation. So we're kind of still working on with a funerary law that was grounded in the idea of the deeper you dig, the further it'll get from being able to contaminate the people on the surface. So they
Right.
still believed at that point that you had contamination from miasmas and bad smells. So that's how disease spread. So all of these are questions that we find really fascinating, and actually I think it's going to be huge once we realize as a society all of these things, what the weight of these 2 centuries worth of burial in France and everywhere is actually doing to the groundwater and what this contamination might be carrying. I know that there have been pigs that were dug up in certain situations which had the plague, and the plague was still alive in there. And so all of these, I find it all really fascinating. It's a question of how did we get here? Why do we find it normal? I completely agree with you. It's a question of we've been clearly doing this since thousands and thousands of years, because otherwise we would have 106 billion graves, which there aren't, because since the beginning of humanity, we've been 106 billion of us. And how can we think that we can continue bearing like we did during the 19th century? It makes no sense. Um, And it's a question in France, especially. There's this idea of dignity. It has to be a dignified burial, and there's the idea that for it to be dignified, the bare minimum is an individual coffin, which I understand where that's coming from. And it also at that point kind of came from some public demand saying we want the right to a coffin if we want one, which kind of then was granted, and it was like, oh, so you have the right to a coffin. So for example, if you don't have the means to pay for a funeral in France, the local municipality will take that in charge. But it also means that if you don't want a coffin, you can't do it differently. So there is some well-meaning aspect in there. It is a question of rights, but whether that's still relevant today. So in France as well, we have quite a large Muslim population who legally can't be buried in a shroud. A lot of Jewish people as well who have more maybe. I know it depends on the rights and denominations, but a lot of people would like to be in a shroud who can't, basically.
Well, no, and what it comes down to is I find it kind of it's not it's like almost kind of crazy to say it goes back to Napoleon himself, that we've got this probably antiquated superstitions that surround death and burial and things like that. And you're right, science has changed. We have become more knowledgeable as to what's safe and what's not safe, and it's a conversation that people try to avoid, so we haven't had that conversation to make the change. And you brought up a very good point that our viewers, I'm sure, can relate to, is that you want to not only have a respectful but dignified service for someone, and you want to respect who they were and their religious right, and how better a way to not only serve them but serve society and future generations by choosing, let's say, a beautiful natural burial in a natural beautiful space. And I just was in your country, and I can say this, that there's no doubt the French people respect and love beautiful spaces. And how would they, how could they deny, or how would they not want a beautiful natural burial space? So I'm sure once you have this conversation and people start to rationalize it, it probably will change rather quickly. But we're here to support you at the Global Green Burial Alliance. And is there anything else, Lucie, you'd like our viewers to know about Humo Sapiens and how they might be able to assist in your conversation?
I mean, if anyone wants to get in touch, we'd love to open a more global conversation on this, and see who we can talk with and create artistic projects. So the idea is really we want to try and make it something that is not an unpleasant conversation, that it's not like, okay, we need to grind down and talk about death. We want to talk about it in a way that sort of brings hope rather than a sort of depressing reality that we have to face, etc. And try to make it something that we can co-create around. So rather than saying, oh, don't do that kind of funeral because it's really bad, say, well, we could do something maybe differently, and we can create comfort in that. I think a lot of natural burial spaces as well in the US and the UK have that sort of appeasing quality to them, and I think that's really something that we care about. And just a little side note on the question of Napoleon being the one who dictated how we're buried. He is himself in 5 coffins. He has 5 coffins around him. He has
Thank
one.
goodness.
He has one lead coffin, an oak coffin, and a mahogany coffin, and I think another oak coffin, and all of that is in a huge porphyr. Well, it's not actually porphyr, but they wanted it to look like the porphyr of the pharaohs, that they came and quarried in from northern Russia because it looked like the pharaonic stone. So there is something that I find fascinating there, is we are looking at sort of a notion of dignity which is that's how we consider the most dignified man, the most powerful, putting him as many coffins as possible.
Maybe they were trying to be sure he didn't get out. That might have been more or less what they were trying to do. Well, Lucie, it's been a pleasure. Where can our viewers find out more information about your project?
So we have a LinkedIn page, which is Humo Sapiens. I can send you over how it's spelled, Humo Sapiens. I think it has an English translation. I can't remember. We have a website, which is humosapiens.fr. And we have an email address, which is info@humosapiens.fr. And we have a Facebook page. And I think that's about it.
Well, we appreciate it. We support your efforts here at the Global Green Burial Alliance, Lucie, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Very welcome, and we look forward to furthering this conversation in the future as you progress.
Well, as do we. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.